In 1993, in Waco, Texas, a religious community by the name of the Branch Davidians were surrounded by American law enforcement, the ATF and the FBI. 51 days later, 86 people were dead. Lives were ruined, and American history was changed. My name is James Phillip Arnold with the Reunion Institute. I'm here today with 3 other scholars who have studied the Waco events, and we're going to have a discussion on exactly why this happened, could it have been prevented, so that you will understand this event better and better.
So thanks, Phil. I'm James Tabor. I teach at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, not Chapel Hill, and I'm in the Department of Religious Studies. But I specialize in ancient Christianity, early Christianity and ancient Judaism. So that's a long way from Waco, 1993, chronologically and geographically. But what I deal with in early Christianity in particular is prophecy belief and apocalyptic ideas, groups that think the world is drawing to a close. Jesus was one of those prophetic types. He was a messianic apocalyptic preacher. So I specialize in Jesus, but I've covered groups all through history. So that's essentially what I do. Katherine.
I'm Katherine Wessinger, professor of the history of religions at Loyola University, New Orleans. And I work in a couple of fields of research. One is millennialism studies. And millennialism is the belief that people might have that we are imminently going to move into a collective salvation. There will be some sort of transition to a collective salvation. And I also work in the area of new religious movements. So I'm co-general editor of a journal titled Nova Religio, the Journal of Alternative and Emergent Religions. In response to the event involving the Branch Davidians, I published 2 books. One is an edited book titled Millennialism, Persecution, and Violence, subtitled Historical Cases. And the second one is a book titled How the Millennium Comes Violently, From Jonestown to Heaven's Gate. And both of those were published in 2000.
I'm Stuart Wright. I'm a professor of sociology and chair of the Department of Sociology, Social Work, Criminal Justice at Lamar University. I've been studying new religious movements since the late 70s, early 80s, and by the time of the 1993 federal siege of the Branch Davidians, I'd already been studying new religious movements for over a decade, and particularly interested in government raids on new religious movements, which I went on to work more specifically and write. I have a particular interest in the intersection of religion and violence, so that has attracted me as well. I did publish a book on the Branch Davidian siege entitled Armageddon in Waco. It was published by University of Chicago Press in 1995.
Well, I know I'm with very capable people here, great scholars. As I say, I'm Phil Arnold with the Reunion Institute in Houston, Texas. I have a master's degree in American history, in which I specialized in the separation of church and state and how that began in the colonial period. So I've always had a love of the study of how religious groups achieve their own autonomy and how their views are to be respected and how the government should not interfere with them. We have that long tradition in American history, protected by the Constitution. Also, I have a PhD in religious studies, and like Dr. Tabor, I studied apocalyptic groups in the time of Jesus, and that became very helpful to me when I began to see what was happening on television with the Branch Davidians. In fact, that's exactly how I got involved. I was watching television that night, like many millions of Americans, and on February 28th,
That was a Sunday, wasn't it? I think.
Well, yes, it was amazing. It was all over television that a religious group in Waco was being surrounded, and there were shots fired, and people had died, and a religious prophet figure was talking about the end of the age. So naturally, I got very interested in that. To me, it was as if the characters that I had written about in my dissertation had come to life and were prancing around Waco, Texas, then I realized that lives could be lost. Lives were already lost. And I thought, what can I do to save lives? So that was the initial motivation for me to leave Houston, Texas, and drive to Waco and try to get the authorities' attention in order to help them understand what an apocalyptic group was all about. So I'm very curious how you three scholars got involved. Jim, I know we worked together early. What was your first impression, and how did you get involved with us?
It was really very similar. It was a Sunday. That's why I mentioned Sunday, because Sunday evening, afternoon, you're thinking of starting the new week. And here it is, Sunday, I forgot exactly the time, but my wife called down to me and said, "You need to come to the television right now. There's this crazy guy in Waco. He's quoting the Bible. He's talking about the end of the world, judgments, all sorts of things, the things you study." So I ran to the television. I think it was CNN, and immediately was intrigued with it. And I probably called you, I think, either that night or the next day, because we both, first of all, it's Texas. I'm from Texas. You're from Texas. And I just thought, this is something I really want to get on top of, be aware of.
Well, Katherine, how did you get affected by this, and when did you get involved?
Well, in 1993, I was a working mom. I wasn't watching much TV. My son was 11 years old. So I was teaching at Loyola University in New Orleans. I still teach there. And so I was working and then taking care of my son. So I did not watch it unfold on television, but I did check the newspaper every day to see how the siege was progressing. And during that time, I was hoping the FBI, who took charge of the site after the shootout with the ATF agents, I was hoping that they were consulting experts, knowledgeable experts. And one day on April 19th, I was in class and I wrote the name Branch Davidians on the blackboard, and I used them as an example of a millennial movement. And a student raised his hand and he said, the FBI has carried out an assault with tanks and gas. The place is on fire, the building is on fire, and in his words, no one is coming out. Yeah. Now, of course, that was inaccurate because 9 people escaped, but 76 people died in that fire. So, of course, I went home and that evening and turned on the television and saw the fire for the first time. And my son still remembers how upset I was on that day because, it was really a very ill-conceived assault. The federal agents were dealing with a religious group who believed that, they believed in the apocalyptic events of the end time. They believed that they would be assaulted and killed in order to fulfill prophecies. So to carry out an assault was just the worst thing they could have done. So that's when I started studying this group in depth.
Yeah, very powerful emotional experiences that led to your wanting to research it and eventually meet some of the survivors.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes. I had 2 books published in 2000, but then after that, I was in a symposium at Baylor University in Waco. Stuart was participating there. And when the symposium was over, Stuart brought in some of the Branch Davidian survivors who live there in Waco. And we sat around in a circle and talked, but then we all retired to the Cracker Barrel.
Yeah.
And that's where I met David Koresh's mother, and for the first time. And, I've got to know a number of the survivors living in Waco. And out of that, eventually, I asked the survivors living in Waco if I could interview them for a oral history project, which resulted in 3 Branch Davidian autobiographies.
Yes.
In their words.
Of course, David Koresh was the leader, the prophet of the community. Stuart, how did you get involved with this situation?
Yeah, so I was at home watching TV, and just like most people, but I remember in the first week or so, as the FBI moved in to take over the situation from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and the hostage or crisis negotiators began to negotiate with the Branch Davidians, and some of the things that they started doing, particularly over the next couple of weeks, really upset me. And so I was a member of the executive council of the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion. You guys know what that organization is, but it's a professional society of about 3,000 social scientists of religion. And so the executive council drafted a letter, and we sent that letter to the Attorney General Reno, asking if we could assist them and maybe act as third-party negotiators. We believe that we had some experts who could step in and maybe help them. And they just pushed us away and said, no, we have our own experts, thank you very much.
Really?
Yeah. So, and when that ended badly, and they said, they held it up, threw up their hands and said, there's nothing we can do about it, I knew better. And that was actually the incentive for the book, because I pulled together scholars I thought could have helped them, and this thing could have turned out very differently.
Well, part of the problem too, I think, is that experts that they may have consulted could have used a different method than maybe you would have used or we would have used, because people come at things from different perspectives. Since our studies are in religious studies, we're acquainted with different methods of how to understand a group and how to interpret its beliefs. It might be really interesting if we could just discuss the different ways that you as a scholar use to interpret a group, to understand it. And then if you could relate that to how that could have helped resolve the crises peacefully, I think that would really be helpful.
Yeah, I think for me, since I work on early Christianity and Jesus, the first thing that came to my mind, and we'll talk about it throughout these sessions, but who's their leader and what do they think him to be? Because all sorts of things were getting thrown around. He thinks he's God, he thinks he's Christ. Some people even said he thought he was Jesus. And I had never heard of the Branch Davidians, so this is all new to me, but I'm kind of scrambling to try to figure out what is the worldview of the group? Who do they think their leader is? Where do they think they are in any kind of a apocalyptic scenario? That was really key. You and I talked about that in the first few days, because if we could figure out where they think they are, then they're trying to interpret the situation. They're inside looking out. The FBI's outside looking at them as a hostage barricade situation, as they called it. I think Stuart's going to tell us more about that because there's a previous history. So my method really was to try to translate their worldview, to put myself inside with them and think, how are they thinking? Which is basically what negotiators do. And I think the FBI has that intention. But if they're not trained, if they begin talking about, well, this guy is just spewing forth Bible babble, and he's talking about the 7 seals, and the joke was that they thought they were animals at first, like seals, in the ocean.
7 seals.
And I think we saw that that's really not a joke. I mean, they quickly learned that it was something more, but still, I don't fault them in the sense that when you come to a hostage barricade situation, you don't bring your Bible normally. But with David Koresh, that would be the main thing you would bring to try to, because he wanted to talk about his faith. I think he wanted to convert them, didn't he? All those hours on the phone. So my method was just to try to get inside the way their thought world, and we can talk as we go on about how you and I did that, but we did it together actually.
Yeah.
So.
To find them in Scripture where they thought they were in the prophetic scenarios. And Dr. Wessinger, what was your approach to this?
Well, I'm trained in the history of religions, the study of the history of religions, or otherwise known as religious studies. And again, there's an emphasis on understanding what people believe, their worldview, and you can learn about that from multiple sources, from things they say, things that might be written, things that might be recorded on audio tape or videotape. And the idea is to really understand how they perceive the world. And that requires a degree of empathy. But just because you're entering into their thought world and then you try to write about it accurately or speak about it accurately, that does not necessarily mean that you adopt their worldview. Usually you don't adopt their particular worldview. Right. But you could also study a religion that you yourself are participating in, as long as you do it critically. You know, take a step back and then look at it critically. So that's the way I was trained. But also, about that time, I was meeting sociologists. I was attending the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion. I've learned a lot from sociologists through the years. And so I've been applying their methodologies and also in my written work. And I think an important thing to note about the Branch Davidian case is that it wasn't all about their theology. Their theology was important, their worldview was important, but the interactions of people in society, the news media, the federal law enforcement agents, the way they interacted with them was crucial for the two different outcomes on February 28th and then also on April 19th. So it's an interdisciplinary approach, ultimately.
Yeah.
So I'm a sociologist by training, and studying new religious movements presents kind of a special challenge. Oftentimes they don't want to be studied and observed and
like they're under some microscope or something.
Yeah, exactly. There's a certain challenge to gaining access, trying to win them over, gain some trust. Because it really does require some embeddedness in the group, so you can make those observations. You can observe the group's beliefs and practices and rituals. Sometimes what they say they do, they don't actually do in practice, and there may be discrepancies between beliefs and practices. But it helps to gain their trust and be on the inside. And again, what Kathy was talking about, trying to develop this empathetic understanding so that you see the world as they see it. We have a term for that. Max Weber, the famous German sociologist, called it Verstehen, but it sort of translates as empathetic understanding. But definitely to see the world as they see it in their own meaning systems. And then beyond that, I would say you want to look at primary materials, any books, magazines, pamphlets, any social media that they have, recordings of lectures or sermons or what have you, and then any kind of secondary materials. You definitely want to do a literature search, see if anybody else has studied or published on their findings on this particular group. Oftentimes that's not the case.
Well, what happened that first day then with the raid? The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms shows up. For my studies, they show up in what you could call cattle cars, I think they're called, and they jumped out of the vehicle and they run toward the house. Maybe they have a warrant, but it looks to the Branch Davidians inside that you have some armed, uniformed
This is like a SWAT team.
Them.
People fully equipped that we see all the time.
This is on Sunday morning.
In anti-terrorism raids.
They're having Bible study, and the Bible study's interrupted, and so this SWAT team is rushing them. Why did the ATF choose that particular day to do it, and why were they doing it in the first place?
Yeah, can we back up a little bit here? I think the question is, was the raid necessary? Yeah. And according to my research and the research of other scholars, and even the congressional report, the ATF had multiple opportunities to arrest Koresh outside Mount Carmel property to not endanger all the other 125 or however many people were in there, including small children, infants, and they didn't seize that opportunity. My interviews with David Thibodeau, who's one of the survivors, and he said that he and David Koresh, when there was a surveillance operation that set up across the street, right, on, from Double E Ranch Road.
So these are BATF agents living.
Undercover agents.
I remember going there. You can see that
Yeah.
house from.
Yeah. That was a
house has been
two-month
destroyed.
surveillance operation in which they had multiple opportunities to arrest Koresh. The raid was not necessary. They didn't do it. My interview with David Thibodeau, he said that he and David Koresh went across the street one day to welcome their new neighbors with 2 boxes of pizzas and knocked on the front door. And the guy answered the door and didn't want to talk to him, just grabbed the pizza and said thanks and shut the door. So they could have arrested him right there.
Well, the impression.